The people who abuse authority the most are usually the ones who do not have any. The sound of cardboard sliding across the bed of my pickup truck echoed through the quiet neighborhood as the morning sun climbed above the rooftops of Cedar Ridge Estates. My name is Daniel Carter, and that Saturday should have been completely ordinary. Sarah and I had spent the previous week renovating part of our garage, and now I was finally moving several heavy storage cabinets into place. My truck sat across the entrance of my own driveway while I unloaded tools, shelving, and boxes that had accumulated over the years. Fresh-cut grass scented the air. Sprinklers clicked rhythmically across nearby lawns. Somewhere down the street, a lawn mower hummed in the distance. It was the kind of peaceful suburban morning people move across the country to find. Sarah stood inside the garage organizing supplies while I carried another box toward a workbench. I had barely set it down when I heard the sharp sound of a car door slamming. At first I ignored it. Neighbors came and went all the time. Then I heard footsteps approaching much faster than normal. When I turned around, I saw a woman marching directly toward my driveway with the confidence of someone preparing to issue orders. She appeared to be in her early 50s, wearing expensive sunglasses, a perfectly pressed polo shirt, and an expression that suggested the entire neighborhood existed for her convenience. She stopped near the front of my truck and folded her arms. "You cannot park that there," she announced. Not hello, not good morning, not a question, a command. I looked around briefly, half expecting she might be speaking to someone else. She was not. "Good morning," I replied. Her expression did not change. "You are blocking the road." I glanced at the street. My truck was positioned entirely within my driveway entrance. Traffic moved freely in both directions. There was more than enough room for vehicles to pass. "I am unloading my garage," I explained calmly. "I will be finished shortly." That answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it seemed to irritate her. "I do not care what you are doing," she said. "Move it now." Sarah stepped out of the garage carrying a small toolbox and immediately sensed the tension. She set the toolbox down and walked toward us. The woman noticed her but continued staring at me. "This neighborhood has rules," she said. "People cannot just do whatever they want." The statement was especially interesting because I knew the neighborhood rules very well. More importantly, I knew my own property boundaries. "I appreciate your concern," I said politely, "but I am on my own driveway." The woman laughed softly, as if I had just said something foolish. "Clearly you are new here." I had actually lived there for several years. Before I could answer, two nearby residents slowed their morning walk to watch the exchange. The woman seemed encouraged by the audience. "People around here respect community standards," she continued. "Some of us work hard to keep order." Standing there beneath the bright morning sun, listening to a stranger lecture me about my own driveway, I had the strange feeling that this conversation was about to become far more complicated than a few boxes and a parked truck. The woman introduced herself as Melissa Grant as though the name alone should have settled the argument. The two neighbors who had stopped nearby exchanged a look that suggested they already knew exactly how these encounters usually unfolded. Sarah remained calm beside me while I carried another storage container from the truck to the garage. I had no interest in turning a simple Saturday morning into a public debate. Unfortunately, Melissa appeared deeply committed to doing exactly that. "You still have not moved it," she said as I set the container down. "Because it is my driveway," I replied. The answer seemed to frustrate her even more. She pointed toward the truck as if presenting evidence in a courtroom. "People use this street." I looked down the road. A sedan drove through the neighborhood without slowing. Another vehicle turned the corner and continued normally. Nothing was blocked. Nothing was restricted. The entire issue existed only in Melissa's imagination. Sarah stepped forward slightly. "We are almost finished unloading," she said politely. "It should not take much longer." Melissa shook her head. "That is not the point. Whenever someone says that, it usually means the original complaint is no longer the real issue." More residents began appearing outside. A man walking his dog slowed near the sidewalk. Another neighbor paused while watering flowers. The audience was growing. Melissa seemed energized by it. "This community works because people respect rules," she announced loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Some of us actually care about maintaining standards." The implication was obvious. According to Melissa, I was the problem. I leaned against the truck for a moment and studied her expression. She looked less concerned about traffic and more interested in establishing authority. There are people who want solutions, and there are people who want control. The difference becomes obvious very quickly. Can you show me which rule I am violating? I asked. It was a simple question. Melissa blinked once. Then she crossed her arms again. Common sense should not require a rule. Several neighbors exchanged amused looks. One quietly smiled. Another looked down to hide a reaction. Melissa either did not notice or chose to ignore it. Everyone knows you cannot just block areas whenever you want. I nodded toward my garage. I am unloading property into my house from my vehicle on my driveway. For a moment, she had no response. Then she changed strategies. I know people at the department, she said confidently. They will not agree with you. The statement caught my attention, though not for the reason she intended. Sarah glanced toward me and immediately recognized the tiny smile I was trying to hide. Melissa interpreted my silence as uncertainty. Exactly, she said. That is what I thought. The morning air felt warmer now. Sprinklers had stopped running. The smell of fresh mulch drifted from a nearby yard while the neighborhood slowly transformed into an outdoor audience. Melissa stepped closer and lowered her voice just enough to sound dramatic. You should move the truck before this becomes a bigger problem. I looked at the driveway, then at the boxes still waiting to be unloaded, then back. At Melissa, I think that decision is entirely up to you, I said. The confidence in her expression returned immediately. Whatever she believed was about to happen, she was absolutely certain she would come out on top. Melissa stared at me for several seconds after I made that comment, trying to determine whether I was bluffing, nervous, or simply unaware of the trouble she believed she could create. Whatever conclusion she reached seemed to satisfy her. A small smile appeared beneath her sunglasses. It was the smile of someone convinced the outcome had already been decided. Sarah quietly returned to organizing supplies inside the garage, although I knew she was listening to every word. We had been married long enough for her to recognize when a situation was heading toward unnecessary drama. The neighborhood audience continued to grow. A few residents pretended to work in their yards while keeping one eye on the driveway. Others stood openly near the sidewalk. It was becoming clear that Melissa had a reputation. People were not gathering because a truck sat on a driveway. They were gathering because they wanted to see what Melissa would do next. She pulled out her phone and held it in front of her. You still have time to fix this, she said. Fix what? I asked. The problem you created. I looked at my driveway again. The truck remained exactly where it had been for the last hour. Boxes sat neatly stacked near the garage. Traffic continued moving through the neighborhood without interruption. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked twice and then fell silent. The entire scene felt strangely disconnected from reality. Melissa began pacing slowly near the curb. People like you always think rules do not apply to them. That statement almost made me laugh. Throughout my career, I had heard countless variations of the same accusation. Usually it came from individuals who were actively ignoring rules while claiming to defend them. I follow the rules just fine, I replied. Then move the truck. No. The answer was simple, calm, and completely respectful. It also seemed to be the one response she could not tolerate. Her face tightened immediately. Unbelievable. One of the neighbors watching nearby shook his head slightly and looked away. Another resident quietly crossed his arms. The atmosphere had shifted from curiosity to anticipation. Everyone sensed that Melissa was preparing to escalate. She stopped pacing and looked directly at me. I told you before. I know people at the department. There it was again. The department. She said it with the confidence of someone holding a winning card. Sarah emerged from the garage carrying another box and placed it near the workbench. She did not say anything. She simply listened. Melissa interpreted our silence as concern. When officers arrive, they are going to see this very differently. I nodded politely. Maybe. That single word seemed to irritate her even more than refusing to move the truck. For several seconds, she stood motionless, gripping her phone. Then she finally made a decision. Without another warning, she stepped away from the driveway and pressed the screen. I watched her place the phone against her ear. Her expression immediately transformed. The frustration disappeared. In its place came certainty. The call connected. Melissa straightened her posture and began speaking in a serious tone loud enough for nearby residents to hear. As the dispatcher answered, several neighbors exchanged surprised looks. Sarah slowly turned toward me. I met her eyes and offered a calm smile. Meanwhile, Melissa continued describing the situation with growing confidence, completely unaware that the call she had just made was about to create a very different outcome than the one she expected. Melissa continued speaking with the dispatcher while pacing slowly near the curb, carefully presenting herself as the reasonable person in a situation that existed almost entirely inside her imagination. From where I stood, I could hear only fragments of the conversation. She described an obstruction. She described a refusal to cooperate. She described concerns for the neighborhood. What she did not describe was that the vehicle sat on private property, that traffic flowed normally in both directions, or that nobody had experienced even the slightest inconvenience. Sarah quietly resumed organizing. Boxes inside the garage. I carried another cabinet toward the workbench and tightened a loose bracket while Melissa continued her performance. The contrast seemed almost absurd. One person was moving household items on a Saturday morning. Another was reporting a neighborhood emergency. By now, at least a dozen residents were watching from various positions along the street. Some stood openly near their driveways. Others pretended to check mailboxes or waterflower beds. Cedar Ridge Estates had become unusually entertaining. Eventually, Melissa ended the call and slipped her phone into her pocket with a look of complete satisfaction. "They are on their way," she announced. The statement carried the confidence of someone expecting vindication. I nodded. "Thank you for letting me know." That response clearly was not what she expected. She frowned slightly. "You do understand this is serious?" Apparently. Her expression tightened again. Every calm answer seemed to frustrate her more than an argument would have. Sarah glanced toward me from the garage and smiled faintly. She knew exactly what was happening. Melissa believed she was controlling the situation. In reality, she was simply moving the story toward a conclusion neither of us felt any need to rush. 10 minutes passed. Then 15. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the pavement and brightening the neatly maintained homes surrounding us. A delivery truck drove through the neighborhood without difficulty. A cyclist passed the driveway and continued down the street. Even reality seemed determined to contradict Melissa's claims. Yet she remained absolutely convinced that official confirmation of her position was only minutes away. During the wait, she began speaking with several nearby residents, explaining her version of events. Some listened politely. Others appeared skeptical. One older gentleman asked whether the truck was actually blocking the road. Melissa avoided answering directly. Another resident quietly pointed out that people unloaded vehicles all the time. Melissa dismissed the comment immediately. The more she talked, the more obvious it became that this had never been about traffic. It was about authority. It was about being obeyed. Finally, far in the distance, the faint sound of approaching patrol vehicles drifted through the neighborhood. Heads turned almost instantly. Conversation stopped. Melissa straightened her posture and adjusted her sunglasses. Satisfaction spread across her face. She looked like someone moments away from collecting a trophy. Sarah stepped out of the garage and joined me near the driveway entrance. Together we watched the patrol units approach through the bright morning sunlight. Melissa folded her arms and smiled confidently. The gathered neighbors focused their attention on the arriving officers. What none of them knew was that the most important part of this story had not happened yet. In fact, the moment Melissa had been waiting for all morning was about to become the moment she would remember for a very long time. The patrol vehicles rolled slowly into Cedar Ridge Estates and parked along the curb a short distance from my driveway. Their emergency lights were not activated. The officers stepped out calmly, carrying themselves with the relaxed professionalism that comes from responding to what appeared to be a routine neighborhood complaint. The gathered residents immediately became quieter. Conversations faded. Even Melissa stopped speaking for a moment as she watched the officers approach. Then her confidence returned. She walked toward them before they had fully reached the driveway. "Officers, thank goodness you are here," she said. "I have been trying to explain this situation for nearly an hour." The lead officer listened politely while Melissa launched into a detailed version of events. According to her account, a resident was obstructing access, refusing reasonable requests, disrupting the neighborhood, and creating unnecessary problems for everyone around him. The story sounded dramatic. It also happened to leave out several important facts. Sarah stood beside me near the garage entrance while I quietly listened. The officers eventually turned toward the driveway itself. One of them examined the position of the truck. Another glanced down the street. A third looked toward the curb line and surrounding traffic flow. None of them appeared especially concerned. That observation seemed to make Melissa nervous, so she immediately resumed talking. I told him multiple times to move it, she said. He completely ignored me. The lead officer nodded politely. Is traffic currently unable to pass? Melissa hesitated. Well, not exactly. Has anyone reported being unable to access their property? That is not really the point. Several nearby residents exchanged amused looks. The officer remained professional. We are simply trying to understand the situation. Melissa pointed toward my truck. The situation is right there. The officer studied the driveway for another moment. Then he turned toward me. Sir, can you explain what is going on from your perspective? His tone was calm and respectful. Before answering, I looked briefly around the neighborhood. Nearly every witness seemed focused on the same question. What would happen next? I am unloading supplies into my garage, I explained. The truck is on my property. I should be finished shortly. The officer nodded. Another officer walked a few steps farther down the street and visually confirmed what everyone already knew. Vehicles could pass without difficulty. Traffic was unaffected. The roadway remained completely functional. Melissa sensed the conversation moving away from her preferred outcome. She quickly stepped forward again. I know people at the department, she said. They will tell you this is unacceptable. The statement hung in the air for a moment. The officers exchanged brief glances, but remained professional. Sarah looked toward me, clearly enjoying the situation more than she was willing to admit. Meanwhile, Melissa continued speaking with growing confidence, convinced that authority was about to validate her position. The irony was becoming difficult to ignore. As the officers gathered basic information and prepared to continue their assessment, one of them finally looked directly at me for more than a second. His expression changed slightly. It was subtle at first, a flicker of recognition. Then another officer looked in my direction. His eyebrows lifted almost imperceptibly. Neither officer said anything immediately, but I could see the realization beginning to form. Standing there beneath the bright morning sun, surrounded by curious neighbors and an increasingly confident Melissa Grant, I realized we had finally reached the moment where the entire story was about to change. The change began with something almost invisible. One officer looked at me a second time, then a third time. His expression shifted from routine attention to recognition. The second officer noticed it as well. For a moment, neither of them said anything. They simply continued evaluating the situation while processing the realization. Melissa remained completely unaware. She was still explaining why she believed I should be ordered to move the truck immediately. The more she talked, the more confident she became. I told him there are standards in this neighborhood, she said. People cannot just ignore rules whenever they feel like it. The officers listened politely. One of them glanced toward me again. This time his expression carried the unmistakable look of someone trying to decide whether to acknowledge what he knew in front of everyone or wait for a more appropriate moment. Sarah saw it too. Her lips pressed together slightly as she fought back a smile. I focused on keeping a neutral expression. The last thing I wanted was to embarrass anyone. The situation was already moving in that direction on its own. The lead officer finished reviewing the scene and then walked a few steps closer. Sir, he said respectfully, can I speak with you for a moment? Melissa immediately interrupted. Exactly. That is what I have been saying. The officer raised a hand politely. Ma'am, I would just like to clarify a few things. She stepped back, clearly expecting the next phase of her victory. Instead, the officer approached me and lowered his voice slightly. Chief Carter, he asked. I nodded. Good morning. The officer's posture straightened immediately. Good morning, sir. The second officer turned fully toward us after hearing my name. Recognition appeared instantly. He greeted me as well. Neither officer was being dramatic. Neither was trying to create a scene. They were simply responding naturally after recognizing someone they worked under. Unfortunately for Melissa, the exchange happened directly in front of nearly everyone gathered along the street. The effect was immediate. Conversation stopped. The neighbors who had been quietly observing suddenly looked much more interested. Melissa blinked once, then twice. Her confidence faltered for the first time all morning. Chief, she repeated. Nobody answered her immediately. The officers continued speaking professionally while confirming a few details regarding the property and the complaint. The atmosphere had completely changed. Only minutes earlier, Melissa believed she was guiding the situation. Now she seemed unsure whether she understood it at all. Sarah walked over and stood beside me. The morning sun reflected off nearby windows while a light breeze moved through the trees lining the street. Everything felt strangely quiet. Finally, Melissa stepped forward. "Wait," she said. "What exactly is going on?" The question hung in the air. Several neighbors looked directly at her. Others looked at me. One officer politely explained that I was the chief of police for the jurisdiction serving the area. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody made a speech. The truth simply entered the conversation. Melissa's face lost color almost instantly. Her earlier certainty disappeared beneath visible confusion. She looked from one officer to another as though hoping someone would correct the statement. Nobody did. The reality she had spent the morning building collapsed in a matter of seconds. Yet the most important part was not my position. The most important part was that the facts had never changed. The truck was still on my driveway. The street was still open. The complaint was still unsupported. And now, for the first time all morning, everyone was finally looking at the situation instead of the assumptions. For several long seconds, nobody seemed quite sure what to say. The neighborhood that had been buzzing with confident opinions only moments earlier suddenly felt remarkably quiet. Melissa stood near the curb staring at the officers, then at me, then back at the officers again. Her entire understanding of the situation had shifted in an instant. What made the moment especially remarkable was that nothing about the actual facts had changed. The truck remained on my driveway. The street remained open. The complaint remained unsupported. The only new information was that she now knew who I was. One of the officers continued reviewing the circumstances exactly as he would with any other call. Professionalism came first. The fact that he recognized me did not alter the process. If anything, it made everyone even more careful. Sarah stood beside me with the calm patience she had displayed throughout the entire morning. A light breeze moved through the trees overhead, while distant birds called from somewhere beyond the neighborhood. The ordinary sounds of a Saturday morning slowly returned. Melissa finally found her voice. "Why did nobody tell me?" she asked. It was an interesting question because nobody had hidden anything. I simply had not volunteered information that was completely unrelated to unloading a truck. "You never asked," I replied. Several nearby residents smiled. One quietly laughed before quickly looking away. Melissa looked genuinely frustrated. "That is not the point." I had heard that phrase from her before. It seemed to appear whenever facts became inconvenient. The lead officer politely redirected the conversation back to the reason for the call. He asked a few final questions regarding traffic access and public safety. Each answer led to the same conclusion. No roadway obstruction existed. No emergency existed. No enforcement issue existed. The situation was exactly what it appeared to be from the beginning. A homeowner unloading items from a vehicle parked on his own property. Melissa attempted to explain that community standards were involved. The officer listened respectfully, but reminded everyone that his responsibility was addressing the reported concern. The reported concern did not match the reality observed at the scene. Several neighbors nodded in agreement. More than one person appeared relieved that someone had finally stated the obvious. As the discussion continued, another resident stepped forward and casually mentioned that homeowners regularly parked vehicles in driveways while moving furniture, landscaping supplies, or construction materials. Others immediately agreed. What had begun as a confrontation slowly transformed into a community reality check. Melissa seemed increasingly uncomfortable. For the first time all morning, she was no longer controlling the narrative. Facts were. Sarah quietly thanked the officers for their time. They appreciated the courtesy and finished documenting the call. Before returning to their vehicles, one officer briefly confirmed that everything appeared resolved. It did. There was nothing left to investigate. Nothing left to enforce. The neighborhood audience began dispersing almost immediately. People returned to their homes, yards, and weekend routines. Yet many left with expressions suggesting they had learned something unexpected. Melissa remained standing near the curb, watching as the situation slipped beyond her influence. The certainty she had displayed earlier was gone. In its place sat an uncomfortable realization. Authority is not created by speaking loudly. It is not created by making demands. And it is certainly not created by calling emergency services over a disagreement. As the patrol vehicles prepared to leave Cedar Ridge Estates, the final chapter of the morning was already beginning to take shape. As the patrol vehicles pulled away from the neighborhood, the crowd that had gathered throughout the morning slowly disappeared. Lawns needed mowing. Errands needed running. Weekend plans resumed. Within 15 minutes, Cedar Ridge Estates looked almost normal again. Almost. The difference was that everyone now knew exactly what had happened. Sarah and I returned to unloading the remaining boxes while the last few curious neighbors drifted back toward their homes. Several stopped to offer friendly comments on the way. One man shook his head and laughed softly. That did not go the way she thought it would. Another resident apologized for the trouble, despite having had nothing to do with it. The mood throughout the neighborhood had changed. Earlier, many people watched because they expected conflict. Now they were talking about assumptions. Melissa remained outside longer than anyone else. She stood near the curb for several minutes after the officers left, staring down the street as though she still expected the situation to reverse itself. Eventually, she turned and walked back toward her house without saying another word. Sarah watched her go before looking at me. That was probably not the Saturday she planned. I smiled. Probably not. We spent the next hour organizing shelves and moving equipment into place. The garage gradually transformed from a maze of boxes into a usable workspace. The entire time, I kept thinking about how differently the morning might have unfolded if Melissa had simply started with a question instead of a demand. Most neighborhood disagreements are surprisingly easy to resolve when people approach each other with basic respect. Around lunchtime, another neighbor stopped by carrying a plate of homemade cookies. She introduced herself properly, welcomed us again, and apologized for the unnecessary drama. During the conversation, she quietly mentioned that Melissa had developed a reputation over the years for inserting herself into situations that did not concern her. Suddenly, the reactions I had observed earlier made much more sense. People had not gathered because they were shocked. They had gathered because they recognized the pattern. The difference this time was that the pattern had finally collided with reality. Later that afternoon, while organizing a cabinet near the garage entrance, I noticed several residents talking across the street. Every so often one of them glanced in my direction. There was no hostility in those looks. If anything, there was relief. Many people seemed happy to see a situation handled calmly instead of escalating into something ugly. The most interesting part was that nobody cared about my position nearly as much as Melissa had. Most residents were not talking about the chief of police. They were talking about the driveway. They were talking about common sense. They were talking about facts. The title only became important because Melissa had tried to use authority as a weapon without realizing she did not actually possess any. By early evening, the neighborhood had fully settled back into its normal rhythm. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Families walked dogs. Porch lights began appearing one by one as the sun moved lower in the sky. Standing in the garage doorway beside Sarah, I looked out across the quiet street and reflected on the strange chain of events. Melissa had called for authority because she believed authority would automatically agree with her. Instead, the situation produced something far more powerful. It produced clarity. And once everyone finally looked at the facts instead of assumptions, the entire conflict began to dissolve on its own. The following week, life in Cedar Ridge Estates returned almost completely to normal. The garage project was finished. The truck was back to its usual place. The shelves were organized. The boxes that had triggered an entire neighborhood spectacle had disappeared into storage. On the surface, it looked as though nothing had happened. Yet small signs of change appeared everywhere. Neighbors who had never spoken more than a quick greeting now stopped to chat when walking past the house. People waved more often. Conversations lasted longer. Somehow, the strange events of that Saturday morning had created an unexpected sense of connection throughout the neighborhood. A few days later, Sarah and I attended a community gathering at a nearby park. Families sat beneath shaded picnic shelters while children played on the grass. It was exactly the kind of event that reminds people why they enjoy living in a close-knit community. Several residents approached us during the afternoon. Most wanted to discuss ordinary topics: gardening, home projects, local events. Eventually, however, the conversation drifted toward the incident everyone still remembered. One resident laughed and said, "I think half the neighborhood learned a lesson that day." Another nodded. The funny part is that nobody cared about titles until after the reveal. That observation stayed with me because it captured the entire situation perfectly. The truth was that my position had never been the important part of the story. If I had been any other homeowner unloading boxes from a truck parked on private property, the facts would have been exactly the same. What changed everything was not authority. It was perspective. Melissa Grant attended the event as well. We crossed paths briefly near one of the walking trails. The encounter was polite and uneventful. She seemed quieter than before, less interested in directing people and more interested in avoiding attention. There was no dramatic confrontation, no apology speech, no final argument. Life rarely works that way. Sometimes the most powerful consequences are not formal at all. They come from realizing that an entire neighborhood witnessed a mistake unfold in real time. As summer continued, the story gradually became one of those local legends communities pass along during casual conversations. New residents would hear pieces of it. Longtime homeowners would laugh about the misunderstanding. Every version eventually arrived at the same conclusion. Assumptions are dangerous. Facts matter. Respect matters. Looking back, the most remarkable part of the experience was how ordinary it began. A truck, a driveway, a few boxes. Nothing about that morning suggested it would become a lesson for an entire neighborhood. Yet that is often how these situations happen. Small moments reveal larger truths. Standing in my driveway one evening several months later, I watched the sunset paint the street in shades of gold and orange. Sarah joined me near the garage and looked down the quiet road. Children rode bicycles along the sidewalks. Families walked dogs. Sprinklers clicked softly across freshly cut lawns. Everything felt peaceful. Worth all the trouble? She asked with a smile. I thought about the crowd, the assumptions, the phone call, and the realization that followed. Then I looked at the neighborhood around us. It was never really about the driveway, I said. Sarah nodded because she already knew exactly what I meant. Some people spend their lives trying to prove they have authority. Others simply do their jobs and let the facts speak for themselves. In the end, the driveway was cleared, the boxes were unpacked, and the neighborhood moved on. But one lesson remained. Real authority never needs to announce itself. It only needs to show up when the truth is finally checked.